Every single year, adverse drug events account for, well, over 1 million emergency department visits in the United States alone.
Yeah, it's a massive number.
Right. And here is the truly staggering part of that statistic. A huge percentage of those hospitalizations aren't caused by, like, a defective pill or a misdiagnosis.
Or surgical error, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're caused by a simple misunderstanding.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. I mean, think about it. You sit at your kitchen table. You stare at that dense, accordion-folded pamphlet of microscopic text they give you at the pharmacy.
Oh, the one that unfolds to be about 3 feet long.
Yes, that exact one. And a patient misinterprets a single phrase about, like, dosing intervals or contraindications, and suddenly they end up in the ER.
It really is a systemic failure of information architecture. I mean, we have successfully engineered these miraculous, highly targeted pharmacological interventions.
Right.
But we are still delivering the user manual for those interventions using a framework that, honestly, practically guarantees cognitive overload.
And that structural failure is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are taking an internal look at the framework of iMedix. So that's an independent medical information platform. And we want to understand how they are engineering a completely different approach to patient education.
It's a totally different paradigm.
Yeah, we are analyzing how they handle the massive, complex issue of medication safety. Plus, we will be looking really closely at a specific visual resource they developed called the iMedix Guide to Identifying Skin Cancer Patterns.
Which is a fascinating shift from text to visual learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But to set the parameters for our analysis before we jump in, we always have to do this.
Right. The disclaimer. We are not here to dispense medical advice or diagnose any conditions.
Definitely not.
We are analyzing the mechanics of medical communication. We're looking at the underlying data structures, the editorial algorithms, and those visual literacy frameworks that platforms like iMedix use.
Right. The tools they use to translate incredibly dense clinical data into, well, actionable patient empowerment.
Exactly, turning noise into signal for the patient.
So the core crisis we are looking at, this really dangerous misunderstanding of medication risks, that is the foundational reason an architecture like iMedix even exists in the first place.
It's the whole point of their mission.
But I feel like we need to define the mechanics of that misunderstanding. Like, why is medical data so predictably misinterpreted by the general public?
Well, it's a good question.
I mean, it cannot simply be a matter of medical terminology being, difficult to pronounce.
No, it's fundamentally an issue of cognitive load theory crashing into severe emotional distress.
Oh, wow. Okay, break that down for me.
So when we look at how human beings process new, complex information, we rely heavily on our working memory. And that is housed in the prefrontal cortex.
Right, the logical part of the brain.
Exactly. And that system, it thrives in low-stress, highly structured environments.
Which is, the exact opposite of the environment where someone receives a medical diagnosis.
Precisely the opposite. Think about it. When a patient is sitting in a clinic and hears a term like chronic or progressive or, malignant.
Your heart just drops.
Exactly. The brain's amygdala initiates an immediate threat response. The HPA axis, that's the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, it just floods the system with cortisol and adrenaline.
It's full fight or flight mode.
Right. From an evolutionary standpoint, your brain is literally preparing to fight a predator or run away.
It's not preparing to read a textbook.
No. It literally shifts metabolic resources away from the prefrontal cortex. So your executive function, your reading comprehension, and your ability to process nuanced statistical risk, it all just plummets.
Man. So we're taking the absolute most complex chemical data a consumer will ever interact with in their life.
Yeah.
And we're presenting it to them at the precise biological moment when their brain's capacity for complex syntax is neurologically compromised.
That is exactly what is happening. And that biological compromise is compounded by the inherent complexity of pharmacology itself.
Because it's not simple stuff.
No, we are not talking about mechanical instructions like, assembling an IKEA bookshelf.
Right, insert peg A into slot B.
We're talking about pharmacokinetics. That's how the body absorbs, distributes, metabolizes, and excretes a drug. And pharmacodynamics, which is how the drug actually affects the cellular receptors.
Which sounds incredibly complicated.
It is, summarizing how a biologic agent modulates an immune pathway while at the same time warning about a potential cascade of liver enzyme elevations that requires intense linguistic precision.
I get that. But let me challenge that premise just a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Is the gap in understanding truly about the inherent complexity of the science? Or is it really just a failure of user interface design?
That's a very interesting distinction.
Because, I mean, I can go online right now, hop on YouTube, and find a brilliantly animated 20-minute video that explains the mechanics of quantum entanglement.
Right, or black hole thermodynamics.
Exactly. In a way that makes perfect sense to a total layperson.
Yeah.
So why does the medical field seemingly lag, like decades behind in data visualization and UI?
Well, it is absolutely a failure of format. You're right about that. But that failure is massively exacerbated by the sheer velocity of modern medical advancement.
So things are just moving too fast.
Yeah, the gap between clinical reality and patient understanding is widening exponentially right now.
How so?
Think about it this way. 20 years ago, a primary care physician was prescribing relatively straightforward compounds, right? Beta blockers, standard antibiotics.
Things we mostly all kind of understood.
Right. Today, that exact same physician is managing patients on complex polypharmacy regimens. They're using targeted immunotherapies, monoclonal antibodies, highly specific enzymatic inhibitors.
Wow. So the variables have just completely multiplied.
Exactly. But the delivery mechanism, which is the 5-minute consultation and that dense pharmacy printout we talked about, that has remained completely static.
So we're trying to pour an ocean of new data through a garden hose.
That is a perfect analogy. The traditional formats have just not evolved to carry the increased data load.
I mean, a standard pharmacy printout is usually just automatically generated from some massive, uncurated database, right?
Yes, and it totally lacks hierarchy.
What do you mean by hierarchy in this context?
Well, it will list a mild 1 in a million side effect with the exact same visual weight and typographical emphasis as a severe, highly probable contraindication.
Oh, I see. So mild nausea looks just as scary as total liver failure on the page.
Exactly. And to a patient whose working memory is already compromised by stress, like we talked about, that lack of informational hierarchy is completely paralyzing.
Okay, so that leads us directly into the architectural solution that iMedix proposes. Their entire framework is built on being an independent medical information platform.
Right.
And it's powered by what they call a dedicated editorial and medical research team. I want to dissect that word independent first.
It's a really crucial word here.
Because in the context of medical technology and patient education, independence isn't just like a marketing buzzword. It fundamentally alters the topology of the information.
It alters the primary incentive structure of the data presented to you.
Right. Break that down for us.
Well, consider the traditional sources of online medical information. If you search for a newly prescribed medication today, what comes up?
Usually the pharmaceutical company's website is right at the top.
Exactly. Now, these sites are heavily regulated by the FDA, meaning they are legally required to list adverse effects.
Sure, they have to tell you the risks.
But their foundational architecture is built around marketing. The UX design, the user experience, is optimized to present the therapeutic benefits as prominently as legally possible.
Right, so you get pictures of people running through fields of flowers.
Exactly. The efficacy data is in large, bold, reassuring typography. Meanwhile, the contraindications are relegated to a scrolling text box at the very bottom of the screen.
Or read at hyperspeed at the end of a commercial.
Yes. Now, conversely, if you pull information from a major hospital network's website, you have a different problem.
What's the incentive there?
The underlying architectural incentive there is institutional liability protection.
Oh, covering their bases legally.
Right. The language is drafted, reviewed, and completely sanitized by legal departments to ensure the hospital cannot be held responsible for a patient's misinterpretation.
So you write it like a contract.
Exactly. The result is language that is technically 100% accurate, but functionally impenetrable for the average person.
So both of those traditional sources suffer from a huge conflict of interest. The information is skewed either by a mandate to sell you a product or a mandate to protect against a lawsuit.
Which is exactly why an autonomous editorial and research team is the necessary mechanism for objective education.
Because they don't have those competing incentives.
Right. An independent platform's sole metric of success, its entire reason for existing, is user comprehension.
They just need you to understand it.
Exactly. They are not managing brand perception for a pharmaceutical conglomerate, and they are not shielding a hospital's legal department.
That makes total sense.
This independence allows them to restructure the hierarchy of information based purely on patient safety rather than corporate liability.
So let's map out how that editorial team actually functions on a day-to-day basis. Because I look at this structure, like almost like an advanced UX translation matrix.
That's a good way to frame it.
You have clinical researchers pulling raw, unfiltered data from peer-reviewed journals, FDA registries, global health databases. We are talking about statistical significance charts, p-values, bioavailability profiles.
Heavy, dense clinical data.
Right. But that data in its raw form is just absolute noise to the end user.
Yeah.
So the editorial team acts as the processing layer.
They separate the data layer from the presentation layer.
How does that look in practice?
Well, in a standard clinical document, the history of the drug's development or its precise mechanism of action on a cellular level, that might be placed at the very top of the page.
Because scientists care about that stuff.
Right. But the editorial team utilizes what we call the inverted pyramid of information design.
Okay, the inverted pyramid.
Yeah. They look at the data and ask, what is the most immediate, life-saving action the patient needs to take right this second?
Give me an example.
Okay, imagine a parent administering a fever-reducing suspension to a toddler at 2 in the morning.
Stressful situation.
Highly stressful. That parent does not need to know the history of the cyclooxygenase pathway right then.
No, absolutely not.
They need to know the precise milligram per kilogram dosing limit, and they need to recognize the early visual signs of an anaphylactic reaction.
Right, the actionable safety stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the editorial team restructures the narrative, so those critical limits are the very first data points the user encounters.
But wait, this brings up, I think, a really significant structural vulnerability.
Oh, what's that?
If the editorial team is constantly translating and simplifying clinical jargon into accessible language to lower the user's cognitive load, aren't they actively stripping away the nuance that makes the science accurate?
The oversimplification risk.
Right. Like how do you curate a medical database without accidentally omitting a low probability, high severity interaction just for the sake of a cleaner UI?
That is genuinely the most difficult balancing act in medical informatics.
I bet.
But the solution lies in how they construct the relational databases underlying the platform. They don't actually delete the nuance at all.
They just hide it.
Not hide it. They use a tiered information architecture. So the primary interface offers the streamlined, highly readable translation of the most critical safety protocols.
The stuff you need at 2 in the morning.
Right. But that text is functionally linked to deeper, more complex pharmacological mechanisms.
So it allows the user to scale their depth of inquiry based on what they need.
Exactly. If a patient wants to understand the foundational biochemistry of, say, why they cannot consume grapefruit juice while taking a specific statin,
Which is a real thing.
a very real and dangerous interaction, yes, that deeper biochemical data is available one layer down. The platform doesn't dumb down the science, it just manages the sequencing of how you encounter that science.
That is brilliant. And this brings us to the real operational engine of the platform, the drug database itself.
Yes, the core infrastructure.
Right. Because the iMedix framework relies heavily on maintaining an extensive drug database, specifically to address treatment questions and medication safety.
Absolutely.
But, a database is really just a repository of nodes. How does this specific technological structure actively prevent adverse drug events?
Well, to understand the protective power of these modern databases, we have to look at medical ontologies.
Ontologies, like the philosophy term.
Similar concept, but in data. Systems like RxNorm or SNOMED-CT, a modern independent drug database does not function like a linear index of PDF documents.
It's not just a digital filing cabinet.
No, it operates as a complex relational matrix. When an iMedix researcher inputs a new medication, they aren't just uploading a text file with a summary.
What are they doing?
They're tagging the medication with thousands of specific relational markers based on its chemical structure, its metabolic pathways, and all its known interactions.
Okay, so if we use like a network theory analogy here, the database isn't a library of isolated books.
Right.
It's an interconnected web of nodes and edges. Each medication is a node, and the edges are the metabolic pathways it utilizes.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it, actually. And this network is essential because a patient's treatment questions are almost never isolated.
What do you mean?
Well, a user rarely asks, what does drug X do in a vacuum?
Oh, I see.
Right. They ask, I am a 55-year-old female taking a daily ACE inhibitor for hypertension, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, an SSRI for anxiety, and I just received a prescription for an acute antibiotic. Will these cross-react?
And that is a lot of variables. That is polypharmacy in action.
Exactly. And calculating those combinatorial risks is frankly beyond the capacity of a human brain functioning in a brief 5-minute clinical window.
It's basically chemically impossible to manually cross-reference that many overlapping metabolic pathways in real time while talking to a patient.
It is. But a relational drug database processes that query instantly.
Because it's all mapped out.
Right. It analyzes the specific cytochrome P450 enzymes required to metabolize each of those 3 drugs.
And if there's a bottleneck.
Exactly. If it detects that the antibiotic inhibits the exact enzyme needed to clear the SSRI from the patient's system, it immediately flags a severe interaction risk.
Because the SSRI could build up to toxic levels in the blood.
Exactly.
Man, this completely shifts the paradigm of patient involvement.
Right.
Think about standing in your kitchen, staring at 3 different amber pill bottles with those cryptic, icon-heavy warning labels.
It's intimidating.
It really is.
Yeah.
And without a relational database, you are trapped in a completely passive state. You are entirely dependent on the assumption that the prescribing physician and the dispensing pharmacist caught absolutely every potential variable.
And while those professionals are highly trained, obviously, they
Yes.
are operating within highly fragmented healthcare systems. Data silos often prevent the pharmacist from seeing the complete medical history the physician has, or vice versa.
They might not even know you're taking the other drugs.
Exactly. So by giving the public access to an independent, comprehensive drug database, you are literally giving them the API key to their own health data.
I love that framing.
You move from being a passive recipient of a prescription to an active, empowered verifier of your own metabolic safety. It intercepts the danger of fragmented care.
So this is really why the concepts of treatment questions and medication safety are functionally identical within this architecture.
They are 2 sides of the same coin.
You cannot safely adhere to a treatment regimen if you do not have a mechanism to independently verify the chemical reality of what you are ingesting. Answering the hyperspecific treatment question is the active mechanism of safety.
Exactly.
But, medical education and patient safety aren't exclusively confined to pharmacology and text-based databases.
Oh, no, definitely not.
We process the world visually. And some of the most critical health interventions require pattern recognition rather than reading comprehension.
That is a huge transition in this space.
And it requires a completely different architectural approach.
Yeah.
Which we see in the specific iMedix resource designed to answer the question, what does skin cancer look like?
Right, the shift to visual literacy.
Yeah, the development of the iMedix Guide to Identifying Skin Cancer Patterns.
Mm-hmm.
It represents a profound expansion in the platform's educational philosophy.
It really does. Because when you interact with a drug database, your behavior is inherently reactive.
Right. You already have the pills.
Exactly. A medical event has already occurred. You visited a clinic, received a diagnosis, and were handed a prescription. You are utilizing the database to manage an existing verified medical protocol.
You are interpreting what has already been decided by a professional.
But the introduction of a visual identification guide shifts the platform from reactive management to proactive intervention.
Proactive meaning before you even see the doctor.
Right. Answering the question, what does skin cancer look like, requires teaching the user visual literacy. It relies on training the human brain's capacity for anomaly detection before a clinical diagnosis ever enters the picture.
Which is incredibly important for something like skin cancer, right?
It's vital. Early detection is the single most critical factor in skin cancer outcomes.
Okay, let's actually dive into the specifics of this visual literacy. What exactly are these platforms teaching us to look for? Because skin cancer is a broad term.
It is. The guide breaks it down to the 3 primary types: basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and melanoma. And they all present very differently visually.
Okay, let's start with basal cell. What does that pattern look like?
So visually, basal cell carcinomas often appear on sun-exposed areas like your face or neck. And the guide teaches you to look for a sort of pearly or waxy bump.
Pearly, like shiny.
Yeah, almost like a translucent bump. Or sometimes it looks like a flat, flesh-colored or brown scar-like lesion. One key visual anomaly the guide highlights is a bleeding or scabbing sore that heals and then returns.
Oh, like a pimple that just refuses to go away entirely.
Exactly. People often dismiss it as a stubborn pimple, but if it keeps scabbing over, healing slightly, and then bleeding again, that is a visual pattern that requires evaluation.
Okay, so that's basal cell. What about squamous cell carcinoma? How does that differ visually?
Squamous cell also primarily happens on sun-exposed skin, your ears, your face, your hands, but the visual texture is different.
Texture, meaning how it looks on the surface.
Right. Instead of that pearly bump, squamous cell often presents as a firm red nodule. Or it might look like a flat lesion with a scaly, crusted surface.
Scaly encrusted? So it might feel rough if you brushed your finger over it.
Yes, very rough, like a persistent patch of dry skin that just keeps getting thicker and more crusty instead of healing with lotion.
Wow, okay. That's very distinct from the pearly bump. And then there's the third one, which is usually the one people are most frightened of, melanoma.
Yes, melanoma is the most dangerous form of skin cancer because it can spread rapidly if not caught early. And this is where the visual guide becomes incredibly structured.
Right, they use a specific mnemonic for this, don't they?
They do. It's universally recognized in dermatology, and the visual guide centers around it. The ABCDE rule.
The ABCDE rule. Okay, walk us through this. This feels like the exact kind of actionable visual literacy we're talking about. What is the A?
A stands for asymmetry.
Asymmetry.
Right. So, if you draw an imaginary line through the middle of a mole, do the two halves match? A normal, benign mole is usually perfectly symmetrical. If the two halves look drastically different, that's an anomaly.
Got it. Okay, so B.
B is for border. The edges of an early melanoma tend to be uneven, crusty, or notched.
Like jagged edges instead of a smooth circle.
Exactly. Benign moles usually have smooth, well-defined borders. Melanomas have irregular, scalloped borders.
Scalloped. That's a good visual word. Okay, C.
C is color. Healthy moles are typically one uniform color, usually a single shade of brown.
And a melanoma isn't.
Right. A warning sign is a mole that has a variety of colors, different shades of brown, tan, or black. It could even become red, white, or blue as it evolves.
Wow, blue.
Yes, a bluish tint is definitely a warning sign.
That is wild. Okay, so asymmetry, border, color. What about D?
D is for diameter. Melanomas are usually larger in diameter than the eraser on your pencil.
Oh, that's a great reference point. The pencil eraser. So about 1/4 of an inch.
Roughly, yeah. Although it is important to note that they can sometimes be smaller when they are first detected, but diameter is a key metric.
Okay, and finally E.
E is arguably the most important one. It stands for evolving.
Evolving, meaning it changes over time.
Exactly. Any change in size, shape, color, elevation, or if it starts to itch or bleed, a mole that is evolving is the biggest red flag.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Because a normal freckle just sits there forever doing nothing.
Right. Change is the primary indicator of cellular instability.
And I imagine a huge part of this educational guide also focuses on the risk factors, primarily sun exposure, right?
Oh, absolutely. The visual identification is reactive to the damage, but understanding the risk is proactive. The guide emphasizes that UV damage from sun exposure is cumulative over your entire lifetime.
Cumulative. So the sunburn I got when I was 12 is still factored into my risk profile today.
Exactly. The DNA damage in your skin cells builds up over decades, which is why early detection is so critical and why having this visual vocabulary, the ABCDEs, knowing what a pearly bump means, is literal life-saving knowledge.
But, you know, this concept of visual literacy in a consumer medical context,
Yeah.
it is fascinating. But I see a massive potential pitfall here.
What's that?
If you provide the general public with visual guides of severe pathologies, aren't you just engineering an engine for cyberchondria?
Ah, the anxiety spiral.
Yeah, the internet is already an anxiety amplification machine. If you give someone a guide to skin cancer patterns, they are going to examine every single freckle on their body, misinterpret the visual data, and just spiral into an algorithmic panic.
That is a very real phenomenon, and it actually highlights exactly why algorithmic search engines fail at medical education.
How do you mean?
Well, if you type a symptom into a standard search engine, the underlying algorithm is optimized for engagement, right?
Yeah.
Not medical accuracy.
It wants you to click.
And the images that generate the most clicks are inevitably the most extreme, visually dramatic, late-stage examples of a pathology.
So the search engine serves you the absolute worst-case scenario immediately because fear drives engagement.
Exactly. And that creates a highly distorted visual baseline in the user's mind, leading to immense, unnecessary panic.
Oh, I have a freckle. It must be stage 4 melanoma.
Right. But the purpose of a curated, independent visual guide like the one iMedix developed is to recalibrate that baseline.
So how do they avoid the fear-mongering?
A structurally sound educational guide does not simply present a terrifying gallery of late-stage carcinomas. It presents a comprehensive spectrum. It juxtaposes suspicious patterns against a wide array of benign, normal skin
Oh,
variations.
that's so important. It provides the negative space. So
Exactly.
you can't train a neural network, or a human brain for that matter, to identify an anomaly unless you first extensively train it on what constitutes normal.
Perfectly said. It calibrates the eye's threshold for concern. But your point about hypochondria touches on the most critical ethical boundary in independent medical information.
Where's the line between empowering a patient with education and encouraging dangerous self-diagnosis?
Exactly.
Because if a patient uses this guide, looks at a changing mole on their arm, and incorrectly concludes, oh, this doesn't match the severe pattern in the guide, I'm fine, they might bypass professional care entirely.
That is the danger.
The guide could inadvertently delay a life-saving biopsy.
Which is precisely why the architectural intent behind asking, what does skin cancer look like, is never to replace the clinical diagnostic process.
They aren't trying to make us doctors.
The platform is not attempting to mint amateur dermatologists, no. The structural goal is completely different. It's to overcome the psychological friction of doubt that prevents early intervention.
The friction of doubt. Explain the mechanics of that friction.
Sure. When a person notices a subtle physical change, say a mole that has slightly irregular borders, referencing our ABCDEs, the default psychological defense mechanism is often minimization.
Oh, it's probably nothing.
Exactly. They think, it is probably nothing. I don't want to incur the financial cost of a specialist visit, and honestly, I don't want to appear hypochondriacal to my doctor.
Nobody wants to be the person panicking over a normal freckle.
Right. And that minimization leads to a wait-and-see approach, which, in the context of progressive pathologies like melanoma, can be fatal.
So the friction is the space between noticing a symptom and actually picking up the phone to schedule an appointment.
A well-curated visual guide intercepts that exact moment of hesitation. It provides enough calibrated visual context for the patient to confidently recognize that a pattern has deviated from the norm.
It gives them permission.
Yes, it provides the intellectual permission to say, this requires clinical evaluation. I'm not being crazy. This meets the criteria for a checkup.
Furthermore, I'd imagine it equips them with the specific taxonomy needed to advocate for themselves once they're actually in the exam room.
Oh, absolutely. That is a massive benefit.
Because instead of pointing to their shoulder and saying vaguely, hey doc, I have a weird spot, they can articulate the visual changes.
Right. They can explain that the border has become irregular over a specific time frame, or that the pigmentation has become asymmetrical, referencing the exact patterns they learned from the guide.
It transforms the clinical encounter. The patient transitions from a passive subject being examined to an active collaborator in their own diagnostic timeline.
They are directing the physician's attention efficiently, which optimizes that brief 5-minute window of the clinical consultation we talked about earlier.
It essentially acts as a triage mechanism. It doesn't provide the final diagnostic answer, but it ensures the right questions are asked in the clinical setting.
That is exactly right.
And honestly, that really synthesizes the entire mission of an independent framework like iMedix. I mean, we started today by examining the sheer cognitive overload of being handed a complex pharmacological intervention at a moment of high stress.
We analyzed how traditional information formats, whether they are influenced by marketing algorithms or institutional liability, fail to provide the necessary hierarchy for safe comprehension.
Right. And we looked at the mechanics of how dedicated editorial teams translate dense clinical data into accessible, tiered architectures, allowing users to safely verify their own polypharmacy interactions through those relational drug databases.
And we saw how that exact same philosophy of empowerment applies to visual literacy. Using curated guides like the skin cancer patterns and the ABCDE rule to overcome diagnostic hesitation and provide the vocabulary necessary for effective self-advocacy.
It is a profound shift in how we interact with our own biology.
It really is a new era.
So, for you listening right now, the critical takeaway from all this is that navigating the modern healthcare system does not have to be a solitary exercise in decoding encrypted jargon.
You don't have to do it alone.
Exactly. The tools exist. These independent, scientifically rigorous frameworks that allow you to scale your understanding of your own treatment. You truly have the ability to transition from a passive recipient of medical directives to an active, informed architect of your own health outcomes.
As we conclude, I want to offer a final concept for you to evaluate.
Leave us with something to think about.
We are currently living in an era defined by data abundance. I mean, we have more raw medical information accessible in our pockets right now than any generation in human history.
It's overwhelming, honestly.
It is. Therefore, the primary challenge of modern healthcare is no longer accessing information. The challenge is authenticating the motives behind that information.
Wow. Authenticating the motives.
Yes. So as you build your own medical literacy, you have to ask yourself, how will you audit the architecture, the financial incentives, and the editorial independence of the platforms you trust to explain your own biology?
That is the essential question for navigating the future of health. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.